Okay, so in this video I'm going to go through another function in Excel related to formulas and some of the formula keyboard shortcuts that I just showed you, which is how to deal with iterations and circularity in your Excel models, especially with LBO models and anything else that involves debt and interest rates that you have to take into account. So once again, I'm going to go back to the basic LBO model that I've set up right here. And first, I just want to illustrate what exactly I mean by circularity, by iterations, because you may not be familiar with these concepts. So circularity at a basic level means that a cell's output depends on the cell's input. So in other words, the interest expense here, however much this company is actually paying in interest expense in year 0 through year 5, will be dependent on how much in interest expense they're paying. Why is that the case? Well, if we look at this model, we see here that this income statement goes from revenue down to net income. Then we have the cash flow statement, and then we have this debt and cash schedule. And basically what's happening here is that the cash that's available for debt repayment is determined by, in part, how much the company has actually paid out in interest expense over the years to the debt investors that it has. But at the same time, the amount of interest expense that it's actually paying is dependent on how much cash it has available for debt repayment, because that number determines how much they're actually paying off each year, the debt repayment. And so essentially what's going on here is that the interest expense is determined at the end of this debt and cash schedule right down here. But then this interest expense also appears up here at the top part of the model inside interest expense and income. Now to make this easier, I'm just going to highlight exactly what's going on here so you can see it. So you see right here that this interest expense income line is being determined by this net interest expense. But the problem is that the cash available for debt repayment is being determined by these variables. And you see what the basic problem is here. You see that these arrows are intersecting. So the interest expense here is being determined by parts on the bottom here, and then these parts are being determined by this interest expense at the top. So that's why we have a circular reference here. And so what we do to fix this in Excel is we go to Alt-TO for Tools. And this looks different in Excel 2003. This is just the 2007 version I'm using, but the same functionality is there. It's just the appearance is a bit different. So you press F to go to Formulas, and you see here under this Calculation Options, we have a couple different options here: automatic except for data tables, and then manual. Now, whenever you're dealing with a spreadsheet like this, any type of LBO model, really anything where you have a circular reference, an LBO model is the most common kind. You usually don't run into circular references with valuations, merger models, or standalone operating models. It's really when you have debt and you're trying to figure out how much the company actually owes on the debt and everything is when circular references pop up. So they're most commonly seen in LBO models. You always want to set it to manual and set it to recalculate workbook before saving. Make sure that enable iterative calculations is on and set the maximum number of iterations to 100. And to show you what the problem is, I'm going to set the workbook calculation back to automatic, and then I'm going to disable iterative calculations. And we see already that we get this circular reference warning right here. So we get this error message in Excel, and we see that everything is going to 0 right here. So this is not working correctly at all. And the reason is, as you see right here, Excel is drawing the arrows for you. Everything on this one column is basically referencing each other, so you get this huge loop and the interest expense is not coming out correctly. So essentially, Excel gets confused when you have a circular reference, and you need to tell it how to do the calculation correctly. So the way to fix this is to press Alt-TO, go to F for Formulas, and then enable iterative calculation with Alt-I. Maximum iterations, 100 is a good number for this. Maximum change, 0.001 is fine. So once you enable that, then iterations will be set and your spreadsheet will fix itself and the interest expense will appear correctly. Now, since this is a circular reference, this is not an exact calculation. What it basically does is it goes through 100 iterations of this. So it tries to calculate it back and forth repeatedly until it gets to a pretty close approximation of what the interest expense should be. And that's essentially how it works. Now, another thing I recommend doing here is under Alt-T-O and then formulas, I also recommend setting the workbook calculation to manual. The reason for that is that you only want to be doing this calculation when you're saving your spreadsheet. So every single time you update something or change something around, you don't want Excel to recalculate everything for you, especially if your iterations are set to higher than 100. So I recommend that you set the calculations to manual. And what that will do is that anytime you enter a formula like this or make any changes, it will only recalculate everything when you actually save the worksheet, so you have more control over it. But that is basically how iterations and circular references in Excel work. So pretty straightforward. In all likelihood, you will run into this when you first encounter a circular reference error. And when you get an error like we just saw, bring that up again, disable iterative calculations. So when you get a circular reference warning error like this, that's when you know that your spreadsheet needs to have iterations turned on. And if it's not an LBO model or something else where you expect a circular reference, then it means you may have an issue with your model to begin with. So let's just go back in and reset that to make sure iterative calculations is turned on. Okay, so what I want you to do is actually pretty simple here. And what we're going to do to aid in our error checking process with this model is to add what's called a circularity breaker to Excel. And basically the idea here is that we could go into options all the time and go to formulas and enable and disable iterative calculations if we want to turn this off, toggle this off and on. But an easier way to do it is to just do this within Excel itself. So I'm going to go into this file and add this circularity breaker right now. Then I want you to pause the video, try to do it yourself, and then unpause it, and then I'll walk you through what I'm doing each step of the way. This doesn't really touch on anything that I just went over here, but it builds on some of the previous concepts that I went over in the other videos in this course. So watch me do it, give it a try yourself, and then unpause it, and I can walk you through in more detail exactly what I'm doing. So I'm going to go up here and enter circularity breaker. And this will have two possible options, 1 and 0. I'll just fix the formatting here. Change this to a number. And so if it's set to 1, then we want circular references to be disabled because we want it to be a breaker. If it's set to 0, then circular references are fine. Now in this particular spreadsheet, the only circular reference that we have is this interest expense right here. The interest expense at the bottom is in effect circular, but the only reason it's actually circular is because we have it referenced up here because we're linking it together. So this is where we're going to insert the circularity breaker. Next thing I'm going to do is name this cell. So I'll just enter a name, and we can just call this breaker for the name. Okay. And now under interest expense, I'm going to change these formulas slightly. So the E61 is what happens when we're actually making this a true circular reference. But I'm going to change this, and we're going to use the if statement that I taught you in the previous video to fix this. So we're going to say if, and remember we named the circularity breaker cell. We named it breaker. So if breaker equals 1, then we want to set this to 0 because we want to completely break the linkage and stop having a circular reference here. Otherwise, we want to set it to E61. Okay, so now we just copy this across. Okay, and so that's that. We change it to 0, then the circular references come back. So this is very useful if you run into a situation where, for example, you just disable iterative calculations again. Let's say you run into a situation where you get this error message. Well, what you can do is instead of dealing with all these error messages, you can just set the circularity breaker to 1, and that instantly gets rid of them because you're breaking the link and you're setting all these to 0 instead. So that's why a circularity breaker may come in handy when you're going through LBO models or any other kind of model with circular references that you're trying to fix. So pause this video right now and then Try to do this yourself. If you get stuck or you want to check your work, unpause it, and then this time I'll walk you through it by giving you all the shortcuts and explaining what I'm doing in more detail. Okay, good. So now I'm just going to undo everything I just did here and then walk you through it from the start. So I'll just delete this line, set this to E61 and copy this across. I'm just going to enable iterative calculations for now. So this is back to what our spreadsheet originally looked like. So the first thing I'll do here is enter circularity breaker right here. It can be set to 1 or 0. To get the formatting in this right, just press Control 1, Alt C to go to category, N for number, and that should set it correctly. So 1 or 0. Then the other thing we want to do here is actually name this so we can jump back to it easily. So we press Control F3 to name the cell. We see here that we've actually already named it, so I'm just going to go in and delete this. So I'll just press New. Then I'll call this breaker, and then I'll press Enter to get to the OK button right here. So now we've named it, and I'll press Escape to close it. So again, Control F3 to actually name the cell. Now for interest expense, here's what I'm going to do. Press F2 to get inside, and then I'll say breaker because remember we've named it, so now we can reference this name throughout our worksheet. So if breaker equals 1, then this is 0, comma, E61. So in other words, if the circularity breaker is set to 1, we want to always display 0 for the interest expense. Otherwise, we want to actually display the interest expense from below on the debt schedules, so that this becomes a true circular reference. And then I'll press Shift Control right arrow key, and then Control R to copy this formula across. So we see it's all set to 0 now. If we set circularity breaker to 0, then this changes back, and now we have the circular references. So that's the basics of how you set up a circularity breaker and how you handle iterations and circularity within Excel. Again, this comes up most frequently with LBO models, but you could see it in other cases. Often if you have circularity in other types of models or data sets, it's an indication that you may have a problem or some kind of error or mistake because you don't usually see it unless you have some kind of debt or interest expense calculation. So that's pretty much it for circularity and iterations. In the next video, I'm going to be finishing up how to find problems with your Excel files and fix them, and I'm going to be going through how to show you how to trace precedence and dependence and how to figure out what cells are referencing your cell and how to jump between them and see how to resolve problems quickly.